All right, turn to Obadiah, please. Obadiah, chapter 1. If you get to chapter 2, you've gone too far. It's in between Amos and Jonah. Sure that'll help. All right, and we're going to start reading in verse 8. Has everyone found it? Obadiah? It might cover 2 pages if you're lucky. Actually, one of the shortest books in the whole Bible. I can't remember if it actually is the shortest book or not. I think it is if you're counting Hebrew letters as opposed to English letters or something like that, but it's up there with 2nd and 3rd John. All right, Obadiah, hopefully we've all found it now. Verse 8. Shall I not in that day, saith the Lord, even destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of the mount of Esau? Edom is where Esau's descendants dwelt for quite some time. And thy mighty men, O Teman. Teman was a fairly significant town or city in the land of Edom. And thy mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed, to the end that every one of the mount of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast as one of them. I'm getting a little bit of a clue now as to why the Lord is pronouncing some fairly severe sounding judgment upon Esau and his descendants, because he wasn't alive by this stage, but his descendants, the kingdom of Edom. It was because of their violence, it was because of their attitude and their behavior toward the descendants of Jacob, specifically the line of Judah, the Jews who were in Jerusalem when King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came and sacked Jerusalem. So this is sort of the topic of Obadiah's book and his prophecy. And so he's pronouncing woe and judgment upon Edom because of the way that they were towards the Jews during this particular episode of history, the sacking of Jerusalem in 587 BC, I think, or whatever it is. So verse 12, but thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother in the day that he became a stranger, neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity. The word there, looked, means more sort of gloated. Nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. So we've got some fairly specific things that we find out the people of Edom did when Jerusalem was being ransacked by the Babylonians. So they loved it. They gloated over it. They looked over it with great glee. You know, finally the Jews are going to get their own. Finally, my brother Jacob's descendants are going to get it. After all, he ripped me off all those years ago. They may well have felt justified. This is an old grievance, the grievance Esau and Edom had against Israel and by this stage just Judah. And so the people of Edom took these actions. Not only did they enjoy it, and they were cheering the Babylonians on, they came in and stole the land that the Jews were being taken out of. They came in and stole the Jews' stuff while the Jews were being carried away to Babylon. They came in and made sure none could escape from the Babylonians. And if they did, they cut them off and carried them to the Babylonians and said, here, you missed one, take him as well. So those are the things that these people did. Verse 15, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. Now, that's a general principle that goes right throughout the Bible. It's not just specific to the children of Edom or Esau here at this time. What you do is what will be returned unto you. That's a general rule of God's world, right? And we're all living in God's world. He made the whole lot, right? So that's a general rule. Here we see a people that had no mercy at all, no mercy. And like I say, maybe they felt they had a justification for the way that they acted towards the Jews. After all, the Jews and the wider Israel nation had subdued Edom at various times. And going right back to Jacob and Esau, it was Jacob that ripped off Esau from his blessing and so on. So maybe they felt justification, felt they had a right. Nevertheless, whatever their justification, they showed absolutely zero mercy at all toward their neighbouring people, toward Judah, towards their brethren, really, if you go back far enough. And the Lord is saying that lack of mercy is going to be returned on the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is one of those great phrases that's used right throughout the Bible, and it means the day that the judgment comes. Every single mention of it foreshadows the day of Jesus Christ's return, of course, but there are specific, days of the Lord. There was one for Jerusalem when Babylon came through and ransacked it. There was going to be one here for Edom as well. And we find out later on when you look at history, not long after this, the Babylonians themselves destroyed the kingdom of Edom, its nationhood. And they sort of moved westward as they were pushed out of Edom by invading sort of Arabs and Nabatean tribes, and they were pushed into the southern parts of Judah, and they remained there. They worked their way into society in Judah. The Jews came back from Babylon. The Edomites, they became known as Idumeans, they remained. And you might recall King Herod was an Idumean. So they actually did reasonably well down there in this new land of theirs. Many of them had converted to Judaism, some by force. But come AD 70, there's no more mention or record of Edom anymore. No more mention or record of them. They disappear from history after the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. Now there are thoughts and theories on where Edom may be today. Scattered pockets all around the world doing this and that, the other. Don't really know. We'll find out when the Lord returns. But one thing's for sure, they got what they reaped what they sowed. They got what they gave out. Now, the world is the same today. In Romans chapter 1, Paul has this wonderful list of attributes that we see, or that he saw in his society, and it's the most remarkable portrait. If you ever get the chance, have a read of the second half of Romans chapter 1. It's a remarkable portrait of our day today. It goes into many of the issues we face today, goes into many of the attitudes that we face today. But some of the things that Paul says is that people will be implacable. It means they can't be placated. Nothing will settle them down. No offering, no niceness, no kindness, no mercy, no grace, no nothing, regardless of how disproportionate it is to what they deserve. They will not be placated. They're angry. They're unsettled. They're divisive. People of this world in general, implacable. The next word Paul uses in Romans chapter 1 is unmerciful. Implacable, unmerciful. If you ever want to get a good taste of that, drive on the roads in Melbourne. The roads in Melbourne are implacable and unmerciful. There's no mercy. It's the quick and the dead on the roads. And it can be a bit like that here as well sometimes. So, and that's just a little example, but it shows you what's happening in here, right? And in the heart of men and women in their life. There's no room to show any sort of mercy, to give any sort of quarter whatsoever to anyone else. You come near me, you'll get burned. That's the general attitude. You can even see it, speaking of driving, on many of the bumper stickers and window stickers that people have on the back. It displays this attitude of, don't you dare come too close, otherwise you're going to get it. So there's this general attitude of unmercifulness in our society today. Let's go to Luke 22. I'm not going to dwell on the history of Esau and Jacob or anything like that, or any of the prophetic side of it. I just wanted to use that, firstly, because, hey, how often do we ever get to go to Obadiah? And secondly, it shows a really, really good example of a people that had no mercy and the result of having no mercy. Luke 22, we'll have a little bit, we're going to skip through a few verses here through Luke 22 and 23. This is a portrait of another unmerciful, implacable people. Luke 22, verse 63. And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And many other things blasphemously they spake against him. Chapter 23, verse 1. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Skip down to verse 10. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. There was some serious passion in what they were doing here. Implacable, unmerciful. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. It's a little interesting point. Jesus was of the line of Jacob through Judah, and King Herod and perhaps some of the ruling class of the Jews at this time were of the line of Esau. Interesting little side point there. Verse 16, I will therefore chastise him and release him. This is Pilate's conclusion, and we know that he did. He the first part anyway, he had Jesus scourged, even though Luke doesn't mention it. That's what happened. Verse 17, for of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who, for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder, was cast into prison. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, Why? What evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Verse 33. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. So here they are, the implacable, the unmerciful. You get a pretty good portrait of them. They will not be dissuaded from making sure that Jesus is killed. This man who helped others, who preached good things, who cared, who loved others, who, and quite obviously so, in his attitude, in his approach, in the things that he said, in the amazing things that he did, this was the guy that they decided ought to be killed. And instead, they wanted a killer released. And anytime anyone tried to, like Pilate, anytime anyone tried to sort of say, well, hang on, what's this all about? No, he must be killed. Straight on it. Immediately, it says, vehemently. Verse 34. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So in the face of the unmerciful, in the face of the implacable, in the face of the people who want one thing and one thing only, and that is the death of a person who least that of anyone who's ever been born deserved it. In the face of that, in the face of being spat on, hit, falsely accused, blasphemed against, had mocked, had a crown of thorns put on his head, had his beard plucked out, he had a robe put over his striped back, and he's had his 2 wrists and his feet nailed into a cross and hauled up for everybody to see without anything on, with everybody accusing and mocking and spitting and so on. In the face of all of that, Jesus Christ says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, what makes that statement all the more remarkable than just the words you read on the page, that sentiment that's expressed in it, is the time and the place in which it's expressed. While hanging on the cross, after 12 hours by this stage of abuse and torture, that's what he says. And what's more, his actions of hanging on the cross, and perhaps he was the only one in the world that knew it at this time, but his actions of hanging on the cross were in absolute lockstep with that merciful sentiment that he's just expressed towards those who put him up there. He knows full well why he's allowed himself to be hanging there, and it's because he had mercy on them already. It wasn't just when he said this, he didn't just suddenly summon up the mercy to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, because it sounded like a good thing to say, and it would inspire the rest of us for thousands of years afterwards. This is deep-seated, genuine mercy coming from Jesus Christ. This is the very picture of mercy itself. In Psalm 51, it says, have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Loving kindness in the Hebrew is often translated as mercy as well. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. That's from Psalm 51, verse 1. Jesus Christ knew that, and he knew that that's what he was doing right here. He was in the process of showing that tender mercy of God, that loving kindness to blot out our transgressions. And he said a few words there to show that. The talk today is called The Triumph of Mercy. And that's what this moment right here is. This is the absolute triumph of godly mercy, that it can be expressed and shown in spite of what may be right or fair or just or what comeuppance, we think should actually happen. This is the picture of godly mercy right here. Let's go to John chapter 8. Get another little lesson from Jesus about mercy, and then we'll see how it applies to us. I'll just move this down a bit. It's right in my face and I can't read the Bible. It's even worse. All right. We need a see-through microphone. All right, John chapter 8, verse 1. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple. And all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Here they are again, the implacable, the unmerciful. Back on the scene, they're ready to humiliate, they're ready to kill. They didn't bring this lady, goodness knows how she was caught. I mean, maybe this is all fair dinkum. Maybe they just made it up. I don't know. Their obvious aim, not only to have her stoned, like the law says that they ought to, because after all, she'd done the wrong thing, and they all being much more righteous than she, were allowed to pick up stones and stone her, of course, as the law says. But their other aim is to try and catch Jesus out here, because they know he tends towards mercy. There ain't no room in the law for mercy. All right, so they want to catch him out. But they didn't approach him privately without, the lady, and just sort of have a little bit of a biblical discussion, a doctrinal discussion about what they should probably do, what Jesus thought and so on. They brought this lady I mean, if they just caught her, she may not have been wearing very much either. And they set her right in the middle of everyone who's listening to Jesus preach and teach, not only in front of everyone. This is in the temple grounds. So they brought this lady and set her in the middle of everybody, completely humiliated her. She's probably done the wrong thing, but, we're talking about mercy. Did she deserve that? Well, maybe she did, but we're talking about mercy here, right? And we can see that what the attitude of these people is that mercy doesn't even rate a second thought. It doesn't even enter into their mind. Verse 5, now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself. They wouldn't be dissuaded from this little crusade they're on here. Jesus said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. That's the most amazing 1-2 punch you've ever seen. That's faster than any boxer, any, lightweight champion you've ever seen, right? That was bang, bang, knocked out. They're gone. This is one of those verses that just encapsulates that genius that Jesus had. Through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It just took all of the air out of their argument. Verse 9, and they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Jesus shows us 3 very important things about mercy. The first one is that it's allowed to supersede judgment. If it didn't, it wouldn't be mercy. Mercy is not the ignoring of judgment. Mercy is not the, pretending that judgment doesn't exist. La la la. It doesn't exist, right? Mercy is, well, yeah, it does, but you're not going to get it. That's mercy. It can't be mercy without the existence of judgment. And Jesus shows us here that mercy is allowed to supersede, to override judgment. That's its very nature. Jesus shows us that what drives mercy should be empathy and understanding of the other person's position. Jesus shows us, thirdly, that mercy is not just an expression, but it's active and it's instructive. He says to her, all right, go and sin no more. There's actual help in there. There's instruction in there. There's guidance in there. Here's what we need to do to move on now. Those 3 qualities there of mercy. So let's go to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, verse 30. And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, When I come again, I will repay thee. This is possibly the primary parable of all of Jesus' teachings. They're all pretty important, of course, but this one perhaps sits somewhere near the top in terms of the one that shows us how we ought to be, the one that shows us how Jesus was to us, and the one that shows us how we ought to be to others. I mean, it's very well known, the phrase, the Good Samaritan, has entered into our own language and is used in all sorts of situations. So the general idea is pretty well known, but I think the primacy of this parable really comes from the two things that I just said. The one that shows what Jesus has done for us, and it instructs us how we ought to be towards others. It's extremely important. Look at what the Samaritan did here. He gave the man first aid to start off with, to make sure he didn't bleed out or die of his wounds or any sort of infection that might come along. He bound them up. Then he put him on the donkey. He transported him to a place of lodging. He gave him lodging. He paid for that lodging. Something that's often missed, and I just reading through this last night, I caught maybe for the first time, brought him to an inn and took care of him. He didn't just dump him at the front door or just bring him in and say, could you look after this bloke? That was the next day that he said that. All through that night, he stayed with the guy, and he looked after him himself, nursed him through the night, made sure he didn't pass away on him during the night. He really put some care into this bloke. And then, of course, the following morning, he arranged for that ongoing care to be had as well. So what drove him to do this? Well, we're told there in verse 33, he had compassion on him. Compassion and mercy, two things that are often intertwined in the Bible. It's very hard to separate them out. In fact, the same word can sometimes be translated one, mercy, and compassion on the other hand. So they go very much hand in hand. The mercy and compassion the Samaritan had for this guy superseded any judgment he may have had. He might have thought, well, you're a Jew, you always treat us badly, so too bad, serves you right, I'm going to keep moving. He may have been justified in that, but he decided that he'd be merciful instead and put judgment to the side, put criticism to the side. The Samaritan perhaps understood what it was like to be poorly treated. He's right in the heart of Jewish territory here in between Jericho and Jerusalem. He's actually supposed to be further north and keeping out of that part of the country. As we know, the Jews hated the Samaritans, and no doubt the sentiment was both ways. But understanding what it's like to be so poorly treated perhaps helped the Samaritan have real empathy for this guy. He was driven by it. And that mercy and that compassion, that empathy towards him drove him to the actions that we read about. So again, a really, really good picture of what it is to be merciful. We read on, verse 36, which now of these three, thinkest thou, was neighbour unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, go and do thou likewise. That's a pretty simple instruction. Go and do the same then. Okay? You've answered correctly. Right? Well done. You passed the test. But you really want to pass the test, go do the same thing. It's not enough to know. It's never enough to know in the Lord. We must do as well. All of these things, you think about it, faith, love, mercy, compassion, all those things, they're not just a sentiment. They always have an action. They always have an outworking. Mercy and compassion is the same. It has action. It has benefit to someone else. It can't just be something that's in here, in our heart. It must have an outworking. It must flow out. What's our reaction to this world, this implacable, unmerciful world? The people who cut us off on the roads, the people who are rude to us, when we're all waiting in the same doctor's office, or you think of any scenario where you get that real rough side of people and that real hardness and that real callousness. Now, what's our reaction to that? Perhaps we're sick of it. Perhaps they should get what they deserve. Like the Edomites maybe felt about the Jews. Some of you have been living for longer than me, and perhaps you've had even more times in your life where people have treated you poorly. And so, by the time you get to some of your ages, you may be well and truly sick of it, right? So they should just get what they deserve, surely. Is that our attitude? We rejoice in their trials. This world's a horrible place. Some people go through trials and they go through it very, very publicly. And, often a case can be made that they brought it upon themselves. There's no doubt about that, right? But where do we sit in ourselves when we see that sort of thing happen? We go, yes, we're waiting for that one. Can't stand that footy player. Boy, I'm glad somebody punched him in the back of the head that time. Oh, that was fantastic. Or when the politician has that amazing fall from grace, or when the celebrity, has some shots taken of them when they're not, looking all wonderful, or when something bad happens to someone else, how do we react to it? We could be like the priest and the Levite, not necessarily rejoicing in it, but not taking any attention of it either. I'm just going to go over there. I'm not going to help out. We could be like the Edomites. You deserved it. And what's more, I'm going to help rub it in. Or we can be like the Samaritan, like Jesus Christ on the cross, and like Jesus Christ with the woman in John 8, getting in there and helping, driven by a compassion for them, and understanding that they found themselves, regardless of whose fault it is, regardless of the circumstances, they found themselves in a place that's really, really awful and hard and difficult. And I've got the power to sit back and laugh at them and rejoice in that, or I've got the power to get in there and help because I understand. Because occasionally I've done something wrong too, just occasionally. And occasionally I've been humiliated, and occasionally I've, had the whole world, or felt like the whole world's against me. So I'm going to go and help them. Despite what we think they ought to get, we ought to think that they ought to get mercy. We were like that once. So like Jesus says, go and do thou likewise. This needs to be the driver of our evangelism. Like yesterday, like the times when you're at work or at school or uni or whatever, wherever you are, just in the supermarket, in the doctor's office. I keep coming back to the doctor's office for some reason. I think it's because I was going through the follow-up list and I saw Gail on there, who I'm pretty sure Lily spoke to in the doctor's office. Yeah, that's right. That's probably why it's in there. By the way, we have almost 100 people on our follow-up list. Many of them I've put in the archive section, but we've gotten through a few people over the last little while. So let's let that continue. Side point. The driver of our evangelism needs to be that compassion and that mercy for the unsaved. Equally, the driver of our ministry to one another needs to be a compassion and a mercy for one another toward our brethren. Let's go to Matthew 18. Verse 23. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. I've got a little footnote in my Bible that says, a talent is 75 pounds of silver, which is worth millions of dollars. And this guy owed 10,000 of them. I think Jesus is sort of really exaggerating the point here to really make it stand out. But he's also comparing what's going to happen in this parable to what the Lord's done in our life. So that's an incredible debt to have, millions of, or billions or even trillions of dollars by this stage. But for as much as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So not only was he going to be sold, that wasn't in place of the payment, right? He was going to be sold, and his children and his wife, but also he still had to repay. Okay, this is an impossible scenario this guy's now been put in. There's not a lot of mercy here just yet. Verse 26, the servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion and loosed him and forgave him the debt. No need to repay. Not just, all right, I agree with you, you pay me when you can. He was moved so much with compassion and had such mercy on this bloke that he completely reneged on the idea of having him sold and his wife and his children sold, and also the idea of ever being repaid, and just forgave the debt. He must have been pretty rich, not to have recoup this billions or trillions of dollars, right? But that's the position this guy's in now. He was destined for prison, and somehow from prison to keep repaying this debt for the rest of his life until he died, and have it hanging over him forever. But now he's been put in a position where he's completely freed from any of that. That's amazing. Verse 28, but the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence, which is a couple of dollars. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet and besought him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. Boy, he didn't learn a thing. Maybe he was still under some misguided idea that he somehow had to try and recoup the debt to pay his master, even though the master had forgiven it completely. Maybe he still had that idea. Maybe that's why he was chasing so hard every single little bit he could. I've still got to pay this back. Jesus Christ has forgiven us entirely. Right? You don't have to pay it back. Your sins, my sins are forgiven. Our iniquities have been blotted out. Even if you tried, you couldn't pay it back. So we don't have to go around at the expense of ourselves, or even worse, at the expense of others, trying to pay this debt back through our own righteousness and our own right standing and our own betterness than others. I mean, clearly, I'm the outstanding one here. Everybody else is not very good. Therefore, that puts me in a better place. I've repaid more of my debt. It doesn't work that way. The Lord's totally wiped it. He's totally forgiven it. There's no need to run around and try and somehow repay it. Verse 31. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, and said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou desirest me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity or mercy on thee? And his Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. There's a fairly severe parable from Jesus just there. But again, sort of in line with what Obadiah pronounced against Edom. You're going to reap what you sow. Your unmercifulness will return onto your own head. There's a positive flip side to that, of course. And that is that if you sow mercy, that's what you'll reap. In Matthew 5, it says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And it's up to us, which side of that coin, the goodness or the severity, that we take our motivation from. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. Really, that's up to you. The Bible always gives us both. Sometimes we can be frightened into doing the right thing. Sometimes it's not a bad thing. Sometimes we could be motivated by, it's actually really, really good for me to do the right thing, and it makes me happy to do the right thing, and it pleases the Lord to do the right thing. That's probably the better motivation for us to take. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that the principle stands. If we're unmerciful, that's what we're going to get. If we're merciful, that's what we're going to get. What Jesus did for us must always be front of mind in our interactions with others. The billions of dollars that we owed was just wiped clean. No more mention of, well, maybe you could pay me back 50%. Maybe you can just, pay in installments for the rest of your life, like, Harvey Norman couches or something like that. It's nothing like that, right? This is gone, completely gone. And so with that in mind, how does that action or that offence that our brother or sister caused toward us, or that thing that makes us a bit annoyed, how does that stack up in comparison to what we've been forgiven? It's pretty puny. Might be a few dollars. We can forgive that. We can be merciful over that. Let's go to 2 Timothy 2. Second Timothy chapter 2, verse 24. And the servant of the Lord. Well, that's all of us, isn't it? Now, this is particularly written towards a young pastor, Timothy, but these sorts of instructions are applicable to all of us. And the servant of the Lord must not strive, must not quarrel, must not go after dispute and division, but be gentle unto all men. That gentle means affable and kind, friendly, but be gentle unto all, apt to teach, patient. That's a pretty important one, forbearing. Verse 25, in meekness instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. We might despair, and this has application obviously to people who are unsaved and also to our interactions with one another as well. I'm going more down the path of our interactions with one another, but these are good attitudes to show regardless of who we're interacting with. But we may despair sometimes at our brethren when we have a look around at them. They make the same silly mistake over and over again. They can't see where they're so obviously going wrong. They continue to offend us or someone else, and we're just getting a little bit sick of it. They don't know it, but, right, here it comes. I'm going to give it to them. We sort of go, oh, not again. Sometimes when we see this, it may feel good, but judgment and criticism doesn't help. It just doesn't. It will not make the situation better. Now, that doesn't mean that the mistake or the offence or the whatever it is, the problem that's glaringly obvious to you should be unaddressed. Doesn't mean that should be put to the side. That should probably be addressed. If it's really an issue, if it's really causing them to stumble in their walk in the Lord, if it's preventing them from moving forward in the Lord, of course it should be addressed. Mercy isn't a total free pass. Mercy instructs. Mercy helps with this sort of attitude. And mercy has the best interests at heart. Like Jesus said to the woman, go and sin no more. A very clear instruction, a very clear guide for how to move on from this now. The problem needs to be identified but ministered to mercifully. Sometimes we need to build a relationship before we can get in there and help. And that takes time, as Paul writes to Timothy. Be patient. We can blow a relationship in an instant, particularly one that we've been working on and cultivating with the idea of trying to get in there and help. We can blow it like that if we lose our patience with the person. And then it's very hard to get back. And then any ministry we might have been intending to do has to wait once again. That patience is a necessity. When we stop and think about our brother or our sister who's in this particular situation, can we actually understand their position? Can we empathise with them as to why they're doing that, or why they're being that way? Why it is that they continually make that same mistake, or why it is that those stupid words always come out of them, or whatever it is, right? Can we understand how they got there and why that is? Have we ever said something silly? Have we ever made the same mistake over and over again? Have we, if we stop and think about it, been in actually a really, really similar scenario to them and just forgotten about it. Maybe the Lord delivered us and we've forgotten about it. That can happen to us as well. In Romans 12, verse 8, it says, "He that showeth mercy, do it with cheerfulness." With cheerfulness. That's a really great, it's like the, giving with cheerfulness, not begrudgingly, right? If we're going to be merciful to someone, it's not because, look at me, I'm being merciful. And secretly, you and I both know that you owe me for this, right? That's not merciful at all, right? Mercy is cheerful. Mercy is affable. Mercy is freely given. It's meek. Mercy, as I said before, it doesn't disavow or ignore judgment. It can't be mercy without a cognizance of justice, of judgment, that some sort of penalty or punishment or comeuppance actually is probably where this is all headed and what should probably happen, right? We don't acknowledge that. We can't be merciful because mercy is supposed to triumph over that. Mercy is supposed to get the better of judgment. Mercy is supposed to supersede it, to override it, to dispense with judgment because it's a better path. In Hebrews, you can read of Esau and how he just couldn't repent. He couldn't get to a place where he could attain of the blessing that he'd missed out on. Now, part of Esau's attitude was that he was unmerciful, and that has probably still has implications for our world today. If you want to go into the prophetic and all that side of it, but certainly back there in Obadiah, it had implications then, centuries on, with the contention between his descendants and Jacob's descendants, even still, for want of mercy in one man. So unmercifulness can have enormous and long-lasting implications. He just couldn't triumph over it. But when we act mercifully, when we act compassionately and empathetically and patiently towards one another, we triumph. We triumph over our nature. We're squashing the old nature underfoot by doing that. That's why I've called this talk the triumph of mercy, because that's what it is. It's a true victory when you can, despite what ought to happen, despite what comeuppance they ought to get, despite what judgment and justice and fairness and equity and rightness ought to be dispensed in such a scenario, it is an absolute, utter triumph when you can be merciful towards the person and help them through instead. James chapter 2. When we do that, we show a different nature. We show the nature of Jesus Christ instead. And that's what we're aiming to do. James 2 verse 13. For he shall have judgment without mercy that hath shown no mercy. Well, that's what we read in Obadiah. What you've dispensed is going to return again unto you. And it'll be on the day of the Lord, most likely. And so, once again, presenting the two sides of the coin. If we go down the unmerciful track, or when the Lord Jesus Christ returns, we can't expect him to have mercy upon us. We go down the merciful side, well, look what happens. And mercy rejoiceth against judgment. Maybe James gets the closest to Jesus in being able to dispense a really profound point into just a few words. James is really good at that. Like, James would have been one of those guys perhaps who you needed to be merciful toward, because he just would have perhaps offended lots of people. He was very direct, right? He just told it how it was. That was James. But right through the book of James, there's absolute pearls like this. Mercy rejoices against judgment. It has the upper hand, always, always, always. The day of the Lord is coming and judgment is coming, but for now, mercy can triumph over that. And if we're merciful toward one another, we will triumph over the judgment that should be coming our way. For what is mercy? It's not getting what you should get. What we should get is judgment. But instead, Jesus Christ got judgment and we got mercy. And now we can triumph if we continue to show it. I've got one more scripture, Micah 6. It's kind of hard to give a talk on mercy without going here. Micah chapter 6. Where is Micah? After Jonah. There you go. In between Jonah and Nahum. Micah chapter 6, verse 6. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? How am I going to approach the Lord? What's going to please him? How do I come before him? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Somebody did. It wasn't us. How do we approach the Lord? If we're going to put our best foot forward, what can we possibly give him? What can we possibly offer to him that's going to please him? In verse 8, we get the answer. He hath shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, so be good, do the right thing, act with equity and fairness, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. That loving mercy, looking for an opportunity for it to get in there and it to help and it to instruct and it to triumph over judgment. That pleases God. All the people say. Yeah.